I wish I watched this video when I first started making indie games. And that's because when I first started making indie games, my games took forever to make. They got filled with a ton of bloat. I didn't really have a schedule. I really didn't know how to actually finish the project. I had an incredible conversation with this brilliant developer named Xalavier Nelson Jr. Perhaps you've heard of him. He's the creator of a game called El Paso Elsewhere, I Am Your Beast, a game called Click Holding. He's a brilliant developer. He makes incredible games, but the thing is, his goal is not necessarily to make an incredible game. His goal is to make a game that he can finish. So if you want to start making indie games, before you even start your game, I need you to listen to this conversation. I think it'll help you a ton.
I never want to start a game that I can't survive finishing. A big part of this is because when I started my studio, I'd worked on something like 40 games. And I would talk to friends who had made games that literally changed the industry. And they didn't look kindly upon those games because they're like, oh yeah, that game was great, but you know, it didn't make enough money to recoup, so the team had to come apart. And I was like, man, if a game makes pizza money, I want to build the type of studio where that's still a victory. So we have games that have not performed as well as others, but I built a structure where no matter how well a project performed commercially, for the most part, we could still be happy we made that game. So the way I make, you know, an Airport for Aliens Can Run My Dogs was made from the resources I had at that time. Space World Organ Training Simulator was in that same space. And as we've continued to make games, we made 15 games in 5 years. The phase I'm really excited about that we're starting this year is not just making the games that our resources allow for, but like just going full in on artificial constraints. That's where click holding came from. I was like, what is an amount of money that as I'm making this joke with the Among Us developers at 3 a.m. is so laughable and small, it makes this joke worth making. And I was like, yeah, 20,000, 25,000. And so we made a game for 25,000. And if you make at every
that was step, click holding?
That was click holding. And if you, at every step, you're like, well, you have 3 weeks left to make this game. We will not choose a solution to any problem that makes it more than 3 weeks. Yeah. Turns out you can ship that game in 3 weeks, 2 months. We ended up having a 2-month dev cycle, but it ended up becoming more like a month and a half, 1 month because of some time we lost in the process of building the thing.
Yeah.
But like, this is the brilliant potential of video games, and the maddening part is you can make a game in 3 days if you build the type of game you can make in 3 days.
I love that.
I want everyone to have the freedom as well as the personal precision as a craftsman to make that game in 3 days, 3 years, 3 months.
Yep. Oh man, dude. One of the most rewarding experiences of my life was when I stupidly told PewDiePie I could make a game for him in 14 days. And I remember it was I live streamed the whole thing. And it was cool because I got like 100,000 subscribers from his audience because they came over to my channel. But
okay.
I emailed him and told him I could do it in 14 days. And then once he said yes, I was like, oh, cool, PewDiePie said yes to me. And then I realized, oh, wait, I don't don't think I can do that. What am I thinking? So I'm going to fall on my face publicly in front of his audience. And I remember I was working in my dad's basement at the time, and he came home from work. And I think I was 12 days in, and he was like, are you going to be okay? Like, he was like, I think you may have bit off more than you could chew. But what was crazy was I got it done. And it was great. And it was just this arbitrary, hey, let's do it in 14 days. And that's that, you know? Yeah. Whereas with my current game, Twisted Tower, there is no deadline. Or at least there wasn't. Now there is. But
yeah,
that's what creates this 3-year-long bloated mess, if I'm being completely honest. Whereas I wish I would have just said, no, this is going to be like a 2.5-hour long game. It's going to have pixel graphics, and we're going to make it for $100,000 and do it in a year, you know? So for you guys, like how do you know what parameters to give yourself with production? Is it just based on your experience of, okay, I know these kind of games make this kind of money, therefore I need to spend this much time on the next one?
I think a lot of it is, at this point, personal knowledge. And this is another thing I really advocate for anyone, really, because we don't live in a culture that incentivizes or encourages it. I'd love to ask this question to you is like, do you know at this point what you need from a game for that game to make you happy that you made it? Is it the amount of money it makes? Is it the number of people? Like, what do you need from a game?
I think because I have 3 kids, it's money. I think that's probably the primary. And I don't know if I don't know if I'm ashamed to say it, but there is a little shame in saying that. But got 3 kids, you know, want them to get a good solid education. And so in my head, I'm like, please God, I hope this game makes enough money so that we can live comfortably for the next 3 years while I make the next one.
So one of the big reasons I think it's also important to encourage people to make their first game small is, do you actually like making games? Is what you like making GIFs that get a bunch of likes on Twitter? Then
yes,
you can just make those GIFs. You don't have to. I've spoken to musicians, and they're like, "Yeah, I really wanted to make a Donkey Kong Country style soundtrack." So I spent 4 years making a 3D platform, and I was like, "You could have just paid for a cool piece of art that looked like a fictional game, and then built the world via a soundtrack." And so, like, what I look for at Strange Scaffold is, what's the constraint that excites me? I was really excited at a game. For me, I know that being trapped in a room, for some people, this is heaven. Being trapped in a room with one game for 5 years, that is my magnum opus, would kill me. It would drive me crazy. What I love is an artificial, interesting constraint that means I can build a really quality game for an audience out the other side while matching it. I love hitting a deadline and hitting it well. And then moving on to the next thing, so I don't start 3-year projects anymore.
I got you. So to answer your question, now that I fully understand what your question is, that my answer isn't sufficient, because the truth is, well, Thomas, go be a lawyer, or Thomas, go be a salesman, or go get into real estate. You can make money there. That's not the best.
Step one is, you need to make games. And that's a really important thing that a lot of people don't know about themselves.
Well, right. And so what I found was, for me, it's like, I have this temptation to try and make the games that are popular right now. Yeah. I can't stand these games, though. The procedural generated, or the roguelike, or the crafting games, they're not for me. They're just not for me. I can't play them. I don't even know how to play them. I suck at playing them. I'd rather just play a really good atmospheric story game that it has a really strong voice. So to answer your question, if I can make a great, if I could build wealth for my family and tell stories in my games, that's it. That's the metric.
That also defines a lot of things. If like a publisher goes like, well, I'll take this game on, but you have to take out the story. You would never do that.
I know, but
this is why you're here.
I know. And I've had situations like that in the past with publishers.
Really?
They're like, we had these people test it, and they really want it to include like more abilities and more skill trees. And I'm just like, I don't even know if I could do that as a developer. Like, that's just not my skill set. My skill set is telling an emotional story, and everything else is just a flourish. The story is the goal. And it's sad because you can sign a deal with a publisher and they know that that's your skill set, and they sign you for that. They're like, great, we need a story game for our portfolio. But then, as it takes a long time, and 2 years later, with new leadership or whatever, or let's say they get a new team, then suddenly they're like, actually, we want Doom 2016 instead of a story game, you know? And so they try and pigeonhole, or like retrofit you, retroactively put you into that category when you signed for the initial thing. That's the big problem I found with publishers, is that it's not the same person you had a relationship when you signed the deal. It changes because the leadership structure changes over time, especially lately. But you, go ahead. I was
going to say, to be honest, like, that's also something that, this is a little spicy, but this is also, I think, the root of so many indie horror stories about publishers. But they came into a room and they said, this is the type of game we want to make. And the publisher said, well, we would like this version of the game you want to make. And the person hears that and goes, well, you got money, let's sign, and then tries to make the first thing.
Yep. And
it's kind of like when, if you've ever speed dated.
I haven't.
Well, if you've ever speed dated, one of the, like, a pretty cool question to ask is, do you want kids? Because that's just like a yes, no, and that defines so much of your life. And like, if someone across the table from you says no, and you want kids, or conversely, if they say yes and you don't want kids, that's one of the biggest red flags in the world. Is don't date that person for 3 years. And one of the big things that I hear indies do, and I see indies do all the time, is they tell me this awful story about their publisher, how they distorted their vision, how they didn't support them properly. And I was like, so like, what did the publisher tell you that they wanted? And they're like, they wanted a story light, roguelike procedural generation game. And I tried to make my really cool atmospheric story game. And I was like, stop right there. What are you talking about? Of course you had a problem with that relationship because you didn't want the same thing.